So I guess when we get into the actual changes in the NVAR forms themselves, I think that the biggest change has really been under the listing agreements. And so I think that's the one that has the most concerns with that, albeit again, with the sales contract. I think that how those relate together are probably the biggest things. The good thing is, if you look at the actual change in the listing agreement, you're only talking about 3 paragraphs. So it's not a wholesale change of the listing agreement. And really, as far as what's new in there, you only have a couple of provisions that are actually new, which really just deal with the decoupling of the cooperating brokerage payments. And so it makes clear that the seller and the listing broker are going to have one agreement, and the buyer and the selling broker are going to have another agreement, and that there's going to be some options for how you kind of show that. So I think that when we get, and luckily all of the listing agreements have the same provisions that are being changed in them. So again, you can just concentrate on paragraphs 6, 7, and 8 of the listing agreement. And so getting into it, under paragraph 6, that's the listing broker compensation. And so the very first thing that they do is they add a provision. They don't really add, they move it up and highlight the disclosure. So again, it says that the listing broker compensation and buyer's broker compensation are fully negotiable and are not fixed, controlled, recommended, or suggested by law or any multiple listing service or association of realtors. So again, that's highlighted at the very beginning to make sure that everybody understands that these commissions are freely negotiated amongst the parties. Then there's it's really subparagraph B that's been added to this. So that's a completely new one for additional listing broker compensation for the unrepresented buyer. So again, provides that if the an unrepresented buyer comes in and enters into a contract with the on the property, then the listing broker could potentially negotiate that they have additional compensation associated with that. And again, that could be a percentage, it could be a flat fee. So again, there's some flexibility in there.
And I wouldn't, don't want to interrupt, but I wouldn't shy away if I'm a listing agent from that new provision either, because as we've seen, sometimes having unrepresented buyers in a transaction exponentially increases the amount of work that you may be asked to perform as an agent of the seller. So if that's something that is contemplated as a potential for your listing, I wouldn't necessarily be too shy to have that discussion with your seller ahead of time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that hopefully the seller would provide that. I hope that as a matter of course. Although again, I would be kind of careful about that because again, at what point are you now? Do you have to enter into a dual agency agreement with that?
Right.
And is the client really served if they are truly unrepresented? And then the listing brokerage is getting compensation for doing that, but they're not really doing any additional work other than the fact that you have somebody. So again, I think that if that's actually used, I think that there are a lot of issues that can come up and be associated with that. But I think that at least as far as getting the seller to understand that there is going to be, and also to agree in the open that if there's a buyer that comes in, they're willing to pay the buyer. I think that's the real, it's just making sure that the seller is conditioned for that eventuality. So, and then there's subparagraph B, which allows for a variable rate compensation. Now, if we go back up to paragraph A, again, it says that, again, seller will pay broker compensation of, again, you could either do a percentage of the gross sales price or a flat fee of some amount, or gross price plus some other amount. So again, I think that that's not really a change. It's just now that's been kind of moved up in the under that paragraph. And then it makes also clear here that the commission is earned once you have a fully ratified contract, and there are no contingencies under that contract. So I think any any other issues or questions with respect to paragraph
No.
6 in there? Okay, wonderful. Then getting to paragraph 7, again, this is the one that I think is probably going to be the biggest issue for the parties, or at least the biggest change. So this is, now you have a new paragraph for seller paid buyer's broker compensation. So again, you no longer have a cooperating brokerage. Those have been decoupled. And so now the seller is going to make an election in the listing agreement as to whether they're going to pay the buyer's broker compensation. And so in this paragraph 7, they can elect that they're either going to pay by a percentage of the gross sales price, or by a flat fee, or by a percentage plus some other flat fee. So, and I think that it's important that there's another provision under here that says, again, the buyer's broker compensation is payable upon settlement. But this next sentence says, seller understands that buyer's broker compensation is negotiable and will ultimately be determined by a ratified sales contract between the seller and the buyer. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more when we're talking about the contract. But again, you have the listing agreement. So in this case, you have the listing agreement between the seller and the seller's brokerage that sets the compensation that the seller is going to pay to that brokerage. Or is willing to pay, right. And then you have the sales contract, and the sales contract is between the seller and the buyer and sets what the seller is going to be paying to the buyer in connection with the contract.
After negotiations have taken place and the parties have come to an agreement. So there's a good chance that you're going to see a lot of situations where the ratified sales contract has a different compensation being paid from the seller to the buyer's broker than is stipulated in these listing agreements.
Correct. And that's where I think we have some of the issues that are coming up and how they will relate to one another. For me, I think that it's, I look at this the way that these things come up in court. And most of the time, if there's a dispute between the seller or the buyer and the sales contract is there, the court's going to look in the four corners of the contract. Right. And they're going to see, well, what are the terms here? Are they definite or are they ambiguous? And to the extent that they determine that they're ambiguous, then they may look at other information. But to the extent that it's clear, and again, we'll get to this when we talk about the contract, I think that they're going that's going to be determinative of the compensation that the seller is going to be paying in connection with the buyer. That doesn't mean that there can't be a separate dispute between the seller and their broker or the buyer and their broker. But I think that the courts would understand that these contracts do kind of work together. And I don't see a judge ruling that if there's compensation on the sales contract and then you have compensation under the brokerage agreement and they basically cover the same thing, that they're going to have a double payment or anything as a result of that. They're going to read those together. And if there has been a partial payment connection.
Going back, I think, to the practicality of a lot of these changes and sometimes not getting too entwined in the words, but looking at the broader picture and what the parties intended here. I don't think any party is going to intentionally seek out to double pay a broker. And I think that will be made clear in later revisions and comments from the association.
Ordinary meaning to ordinary words.
Right. Lawyers, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of my professors taught me that.
Well, the one thing that we always preach in this industry is communication, communication, communication. This stuff doesn't come up, and there really shouldn't be a dispute on compensation if there is communication amongst the parties. You have a definite brokerage agreement, and you have a definite sales contract. And as long as everybody is communicating with one another, there shouldn't be a problem. So it's now, again, if there's a difference between what's being paid on the sales contract and what's under the listing agreement, then I think it's incumbent upon the agent or the broker, whether it's on the listing side. I would imagine it's more on the selling side, that they would make us aware of that. And we as the settlement agents, again, we go by the contract. So if the contract says that this is what's going to be paid, that's what we're going to do. Now, if we get additional information, somebody says, wait, there's a separate agreement, and here's, it's more than this, and they provide that evidence to us, then we have to follow that also. Again, but ultimately, we have to follow what the parties have agreed upon. So, I think.
So Charles, I'm going to put you under the hot seat here and ask you some rapid fire questions about how some of these agreements, specifically the offer to pay a buyer's broker, can be advertised. You ready?
Okay.
Can you advertise that the seller is willing to pay a buyer's broker commission on the MLS?
Not after August 17th.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so at least right now, again, those dates are all changing, but I think we're getting close enough to August 17th. I don't think that has been pushed back. I think the November settlement date, it seems likely to get pushed back now that there's been some sellers that are objecting to the overall settlement. But as far as that August 17th date, I think that seems to be pretty definite.
What about on a brokerage website?
Oh, yes, you can on a brokerage website.
What about on an individual agent's social media account?
And on an individual agent's social media account.
And finally, to the extent people still do it, what about on printed flyers?
And on printed flyers.
There you go.
God bless them. So,
Passed, 100%.
100%.
well, good.
Good for you.
I was sweating it. So, and then finally we have paragraph 8, and that's with the seller's subsidy. So again, it's a new paragraph. They've separated it out, and it just provides that the seller can make a payment directly to the buyer in connection with any costs of settlement that the buyer may have incurred. And again, we've had a seller subsidy provision. That's not new at all. Of course, the question is, now MLS will have a provision in there for seller subsidies. They will not have a provision after August 17th for cooperating brokerage payments. So that's going to go away. And so then the question is, well, if you're going to go and telegraph your willingness to pay a buyer's broker, is the seller's subsidy field in there the means of doing that? My own personal opinion is that it's kind of wonky to do that, but I can also understand that if you want to go and signal to everybody, and that if you're dealing with the MLS, and the MLS is the main point of contact for the brokerages in determining where that compensation may or may not be coming from on a public basis, then I think that I could see in the short term where people may do that. So I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, the MLS, from the conversations I've had with folks, was aware of that and did try to make sure there are specific carve-outs and disclaimers stating that the disclosure of seller subsidy when you go to list the property on MLS now cannot be conditioned on it being diverted at the end towards a buyer broker compensation. So they're aware of it and are going to include disclaimers on those fields now when agents go to input their listings going forward.
Okay, well, there goes that. So, and really with that, those are the major changes to the listing agreement. So again, other than the decoupling of the cooperating, so no longer do you have cooperating brokerage commissions. You have it separated out between the agreement on the listing side and then the seller determining whether or not they are willing to offer compensation to the seller, to the buyer's broker. So other than that, it's not a real sea change in what we've been doing. So
Fantastic.